Welcome, everybody. My name is Carol Greenfield. I am the chair of Hadassah's Professional Councils. And this presentation tonight is sponsored by the Attorneys and Judges Council. This webinar will be recorded. The chat box has been disabled, but if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A box. The chat box will be used by the panelists and by staff to put interesting information and useful links for you, so feel free to take advantage of those. The webinar is closed captioned. The council that's sponsoring this has three co-chairs, Rhonda Mayer, Lynn Altschuler, and Tamar Sadeh. The speaker cannot answer any personal medical questions, and he's sharing the legislation information in terms of policy and not suggesting advocacy. So council membership is a free benefit of your Hadassah membership. If anyone would like to join, the information can be found in the chat and will also be in the follow-up letter that you'll receive after this webinar. Okay, so our speaker tonight is Dr. Jordan Tishler. He's a cannabinoid specialist, a term that he coined many years ago as he sought to increase the standard of care for patients and the level of education of his colleagues based on data and best practices. He's the founder and president of the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists, which aims to educate clinicians, lawmakers, and the industry about best practices and needed tools for proper patient care. Dr. Tishler graduated from both Harvard College and Harvard Medical School, trained as an internal medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and is in the faculty at both Mass General Brigham and Harvard Medical School. There's many more interesting things I could say about Jordan, but I'm going to let him tell you himself. So take it away, Jordan. And thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it is my pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Hadassah and the Attorneys and Judges Council for hosting this event. I'm looking forward to telling you a few things as we go and then responding to questions as they come. So let me start my screen share here and we can get right into it. So the topic we're going to address today is cannabis patients and legalization. Where do we go from here? And we subtitle this, Why We Need a More Medical System. And we're going to talk about the ways in which the system that exists really could be improved for the betterment of patient care. Just a few words about myself. Carol was kind enough to point out that I went to Harvard Medical School and trained at the Brigham Women's Hospital. After that, I went and practiced emergency medicine for the VA. And I was there actually for about 15 years. And it was through my experiences there that led me to this cannabis or cannabinoid odyssey. As one might imagine, I saw many, many veterans whose lives were really harmed, possibly in some cases even destroyed by various substances. And on the top 10 list of substances, 1 through 9 were alcohol. And then maybe a little smattering of opioids and benzodiazepines. So in 2011, when Massachusetts, my home state, started to talk about a ballot initiative for medical marijuana, I thought to myself, you know, I've seen so many veterans harmed by these other substances, and I've never seen anybody sick from cannabis in my emergency room. So what's going on there? And what do they mean by medical cannabis? And that led me to several years worth of diving into the literature. At the time, certainly it was a political thing to say, well, I would support it, but there's no data. At the time, if you went to PubMed, which is the Google for science, and put in the word cannabis, you would get a mere 25,000 studies. Now, of course, not all of those studies were helpful. Not all of them were well done. Many of them were devised to prove the harms of cannabis. But that's what I faced at that time. And I spent those several years wading through those 25,000 studies. And I came away from my endeavor with the idea that cannabis and cannabinoids could in fact be used for medical purposes. But like every medicine, you had to focus on it like a medicine. You had to think about what were you treating, who were you treating, how much were you giving them, how were you giving it, and all of those sorts of things. And we'll maybe talk a little bit more about that. As you can imagine, the VA at that time was not really all that thrilled with my interest. And thankfully, the question of what the propriety of that went all the way up to the chief legal counsel in DC, who said, well, look, whatever he's doing on his own time was fine. And that was great. But it became clear that the VA was not going to be able to take on this kind of medicine. And then I looked around at the Harvard hospitals where I was faculty, and it was very clear that they were not in a position either. And that led me to form my private practice, which is called Inhale MD. I never really wanted to be in private practice. It wasn't on my bucket list, but it became the vehicle by which I could help take care of patients with these interesting medicines. And more importantly, the aegis by which I could go back to my colleagues in these various medical centers and present them with this information and try to help take care of their patients. Over time, this led me to founding the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists. We'll talk a little bit more about them, but the gist of it here is that it's about providing education to clinicians of various stripes, as well as to lawyers and policymakers throughout the country and around the globe. I just want to take a moment to say that I am an advisor to a medical cannabis related company called Troche, which makes actually a delivery vehicle. And frankly, this has nothing whatsoever to do with our talk tonight, but I wanted to mention it. Here we have a map of the United States. There's not a lot of message here, except to say if you're looking at the green of various shades, you're seeing where there is either medical and recreational use available. And really, if you're looking for the red where there is nothing, there isn't that much of it left. So we have to understand that the vast majority of people live in a place where they have some sort of access to medical cannabis or cannabinoids. And as a result, it's really time that we have an understanding as a nation of a unified policy, and one that in particular supports medical care in addition to people's recreational desires. We know that many medications fall under the purview of the Drug Enforcement Agency through the various schedules of the Controlled Substances Act. There's one schedule in particular that we need to pay attention to. That's the red one at the top, which is Schedule 1. And basically the idea in Schedule 1 is that those drugs are not usable under any circumstance, that they have no medical value and are considered to be dangerous. And certainly many of the medications that are in Schedule 1 are rightly there, but many of them, including cannabis, do not belong there based on scientific understanding. But this is the law of the land at the moment, and this is what we need to contend with. Let me go back for a moment and just point out that the lesser controlled schedules, like 2, contain things like opium and cocaine and oxycodone and methamphetamines, many of which we think are, in fact, more potentially harmful than cannabis. Yet we are, in fact, able to prescribe them because they do have, despite the danger, legitimate medical uses. The following slides are a bunch of quotations from my patients, which I think are illustrative of the fact that the current medical system is problematic. I don't know what your doctor is talking about. Don't listen to him. I'll tell you what to do. This was the reaction of a bud tender to one of my patients who walked in with an actual written prescription. They kept trying to get me to buy more. They have volume deals and push other products. And what's up with a prize wheel? This isn't The Price is Right. This is one of my patients describing their experience going to the dispensary. He told me to add this keef stuff to my vaporizer, and now I feel sick, doctor. Why? Keef is a highly concentrated form of cannabis. It's not something that I recommend to patients, but as you can see, this particularly elderly gentleman went to the store where his salesperson, or bud tender as they're called, gave him some bum advice, and it made him sick. You were right, doctor. They immediately suggested CBD. It's a good thing you warned me about how dangerous this could be for me. This was actually a very interesting scenario for me. This was a gentleman who had come to me for sort of routine back pain that otherwise would not have been a big deal. But incidentally, he had had a liver transplant and was on a number of medications that can interact quite dangerously with CBD. And so I had explained that to him in great detail, and thankfully he listened to me. But it was interesting to hear that, in fact, when he went to the dispensary, they immediately tried to give him some of this stuff. The current dispensing system, frankly speaking, is very good for the industry. It allows them to use all sorts of marketing, misdirection, the giving of unqualified medical advice, upselling tactics with deals and buy one, get one kind of things. They're also able to make false claims. Only recently have we seen the FDA and FTC get into the process of sending cease and desist type letters about these things, but really only in the most egregious cases. And it's quite unclear that this trickles down to the level of the sales agent. The sales agents, simply put, cannot possess adequate medical knowledge. Otherwise, they would have, well, frankly, my job. And it isn't reasonable for both the dispensing companies and, frankly, the dispensing system to expect that they should be in a position to give medical advice. And so, in fact, I think that these poor bud tenders are very much caught in the middle between their bosses who tell them that they must give this advice and at the same time sell lots of product, and the patient's best interest. And that conflict of interest really is rampant. What's most important, I think, for us is to understand that these problems do not exist in the pharmacy and pharmaceutical world, because over the last 100 or so years, we've rooted them out. It's not as though they didn't exist. It's that we have seen the damage that they would do, and we have put in place regulation at the federal level that precludes this kind of conflict of interest. Fundamentally, what we have to understand, and that is really not well understood in the general population, is that patients are simply not the same as recreational users. It suits the industry to conflate the two, but in fact, the goals of these two groups are often exactly the opposite. For example, when it comes down to recreational users, they're looking for an experience. As I said, they love the ride. So that leads them to say, okay, what's new? What's exciting? What can I try? The experimentation becomes part of the fun. And frankly speaking, and this is not necessarily a good thing, the general point of view is more is better. More products, more dose, more time spent using the substance. Patients, on the other hand, generally speaking, have no interest in that ride or that experience. They just want to feel normal. They just want to get back to themselves. The high or the intoxication is really a side effect, and largely an unwanted side effect. They want to focus with me on the minimum effective dose, right? How little of this stuff can we get away with using just to get the benefit that we need? And of course, most patients are not, whatever it is that we're thinking about treating with cannabis, that's not the only thing going on. They're usually very complex with multiple diagnoses and a multiplicity of medications, all of which we need to be aware of and think about. So how did we get here? Well, the period of time after the Civil War leading up to 1934 is called the patent medicine era. And it is an era that, frankly, spawned the legislation that ended it, where we could see products like the one pictured here that contained all manner of things, some of which turn out to be quite dangerous for people, but there were no regulations, and products, that were often labeled sort of Dr. John's elixir would say, it's good for what ails you. So we saw a lot of unsubstantiated claims being made by the manufacturer, like Dr. John's, or by the seller. There was no quality control. There was great variability in the products, and unfortunately, quite a lot of contamination with things that could cause significant damage. And of course, when we boiled it all down, the other problem is that there was no proven efficacy, meaning you could take the serum and it might work or it might not work. Who knows? In 1934, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was enacted, and that established the FDA. It established their role in the state in making safety regulations, standardizing dose measurements. It also defines a prescription, which is a very important communication tool. And it specifies things like the medication, the dose, how it's administered, the frequency with which it's administered, and perhaps most importantly, or at least not least importantly, is the amount to be sold or dispensed. All of these things are things that are lacking at the moment in the cannabis world. It established sales limits, and it addressed the issue around conflict of interest. So where is the FDA now? Well, the problem is that the Schedule I listing of cannabis really does tie the FDA's hands. They can't very well regulate something that is simply illegal. Furthermore, their mandate requires that when they do regulate, they do it with data. And in many instances, that requires the accumulation of data that we simply are forbidden from acquiring, again, because cannabis is Schedule I. So this ties their hands. And most importantly, perhaps, we know that the FDA is underfunded. They are always stretching their budget, and frankly, it's one of those situations where if they take on something new, they know that they're going to have to draw funds from some other area of their operations, and that will end up with the short end of the stick. And so far, we've seen no new allocations of funding for new cannabis operations. I said here, I suspect that they're eagerly waiting to get involved. I actually know that they are eagerly involved at this point. They have several working groups that have been ongoing for a number of years, both looking at CBD, which continues to give them a black eye because they haven't promulgated regulation, but also having to do with THC and cannabis more broadly. Herein lies one of the major problems that we face. In 1994, unfortunately, the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act was enacted. And I think that somebody thought this was a good idea. If nothing else, it certainly established a huge industry, but it stripped the FDA of its regulatory authority other than good manufacturing products, and their post facto enforcement over things that were considered a supplement. It empowered an industry that is based entirely on falsehoods with no need to prove safety or efficacy, and is turned into a $164 billion a year industry. Just by contrast, another United States agency, the United States Preventive Services Task Force, which is a group that reviews scientific and medical recommendations, repeatedly review the science around supplementation and show that there is no value and occasionally harms associated with supplements in the absence of a demonstrable vitamin deficiency. So if you ask doctors, they're going to say no to supplements, and yet here we have an entire $164 billion a year industry. This, unfortunately, is the model that's being touted for cannabis products and marketing, and I think it's very clearly not in the interest of patients. Okay, come on, computer. So what do we know about cannabis that's relevant for our discussion today? Well, the first thing is we have to acknowledge that THC is the main medicine. We've got over 70 years worth of good research on this. It is true that THC does cause intoxication as a side effect, But this is true of many, many medications in terms of their side effects. And so it simply means that we need to use this cautiously and wisely, but it's certainly not a reason not to use it. There are, you may be aware, all these different types of cannabis. Technically, they're cultivars, but people call them strains. And the industry would like us to believe that each one of these different strains has unique medical properties. And so as a patient, your job is simply to keep buying more and more cannabis of different types until you find the one that's sort of magically suited to you. I think you can hear from my tone that I think this is baloney. And the reality here is that when we've studied this, we find no significant medical differences between strains. I have no doubt that ultimately we will understand the interplay between the various chemicals that we get from cannabis in a different way, and may in fact be able to use them in combination for different purposes. But those differences are not well represented amongst the strains, and therefore the strains are not likely to be of use in and of themselves. In 2018, the Farm Bill passed under the aegis of Mitch McConnell, legalized hemp, which is cannabis that doesn't produce much or any THC. And as a result, CBD and other cannabinoids from the hemp cultivars have become legal and are ubiquitously available in most states and online. And CBD is certainly the one that's gotten the most attention. What do we know about CBD? Well, there are a whole bunch of what we call preclinical studies. This means rat studies or test tube, cell culture type studies. And in those circumstances, CBD looks very interesting for the things that it can do for us. However, in the real world, what we see is that people are not getting anywhere near the doses of CBD that have been demonstrated in these preclinical studies. And in fact, we have fairly few studies in adult human beings. We're starting to get some of them trickling in now, and quite frankly, so far, that doesn't look that great. And of course, CBD has been shown to interact with a whole bunch of common medications, many of which are quite dangerous, and some of them are even over the counter, like Claritin. So that is a potential problem, and probably is a real problem that's just waiting to happen. And of course, it turns out that high doses of CBD may very well cause some direct liver toxicity. So my expectation is that as we get more information about CBD, we're going to find that it is useful, but that it's going to be at much higher doses than what we're seeing at the moment. That's going to require compensation from insurance because nobody will be able to afford it. And that we will be using it in much more specific instances and probably under some continued medical guidance, monitoring of blood tests to avoid some of these potential harms. There are a whole bunch of other cannabinoids and another class of chemicals called terpenes, which get discussed an awful lot in the cannabis world. But interestingly enough, there's no data beyond that preclinical stuff. It's all very interesting, but none of it is ready for human use. And yet, I might add, they are all freely available on the internet, which really gets me back to that patent medicine era approach to things. I mentioned those drug interactions. Here's just some examples. On the left column are the medical medicines that people were searching for on Google. And what we're looking for in these columns are these red Ys. This is where we have a known interaction. And so we can see that CBD does in fact interact with esomeprazole or Nexium. That's not a terribly concerning interaction, even if it is demonstrable. There are a bunch of these Ts, which are theoretical interactions, but actually aren't seen in the real world. And so as you can see, thankfully, most of the stuff that people were worrying about were not terribly concerning. On the other hand, in the right panel are all the ones that I was concerned about because they are commonly used and fairly dangerous medications like amiodarone, which is a cardiac drug, everolimus, and somewhere on here is tacrolimus. These are anti-rejection drugs for people who've had organ transplants. And then there's our friend, as I mentioned, loratadine or Claritin. These are medications that if we knock them out of whack by adding CBD into the system, the outcome is actually potentially fatal. Thankfully, on the THC side, in both panels, you can see that there aren't many interactions to be concerned about. Currently, there are two major bills in the houses of Congress that are aimed at supposedly comprehensive reform of our cannabis policy. On the House side, we have the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act, otherwise known as the MORE Act. It has passed the House 3 times, but never been taken up in the Senate. And it focuses solely on business and on racial justice issues. I think it's important for us to acknowledge that that we want to be relatively business friendly if we can be, and certainly the issues around racial justice are paramount, but it is not necessarily the sole or most comprehensive approach. There's absolutely no mention of patient care, and unfortunately in this bill, there's no actual regulatory framework. So this bill is unlikely to pass as it is into something that is a usable law. And then there's Mr. Schumer's bill, which is the Cannabis Administration Opportunity Act. This is also very business friendly. It's very heavy on taxation and actually is probably untenable because of that, even after they revised the taxation downward, simply because when you combine federal tax with state tax on people who are already price sensitive, you pretty much just drive them back into the illicit market. There's a significant amount of this bill devoted to the racial justice issues, as it should be, but it just, in the merest of moments, assigns medical care to the FDA and provides no framework for their working process and no budget allocation, as we've talked about being crucial. Clearly, the problem here is that there's no discussion of healthcare and no acknowledgement that healthcare is a social justice issue. So what should a federal medical system provide? Well, these are basic tenets of the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists. We believe that we need to be able to write and required to write exact prescriptions. This means doctors and other clinicians need to step up to the plate and take ownership that they're doing the right thing. And they need to observe the doctrine of informed consent, which is not being taken care of at this point. By the same token, we need the dispensing groups to be legally bound to honor that prescription in a way that then assures the clinician that the patient is getting the right stuff and provides the right stuff for patients without the patients having to be particularly vigilant about misdirection. We also need both companies and dispensing agencies to stop making medical claims for which they are not qualified. We need state-to-state interoperability. This is about the fact that many of my older patients in Massachusetts are snowbirds and go to Florida for several months, and they should be able to take their cannabis medicine with them just like they would take their blood pressure medicines. And should they run out of this medicine in Florida, I should be able to write them a temporary prescription until they return home. Every state has differing safety standards, some of which are more rigorous than others. Ironically, for example, Maine has great safety standards on their recreational side, but on the medical side, they have no standard at all. So we need a common national safety standard that ensures everybody's well-being. We need clinical discretion. And what this means is that if you've noticed, every state has come up with a list of diagnoses that they feel are acceptable for the prescription of medical cannabis. And unfortunately, most of those lists are completely devoid of data. and include things that should not be included, such as glaucoma, and do not, in many cases, include things that it should include where there's great data, for example, chronic pain. And so we really need to get the lawmakers and regulators out of the medical decision-making process and put the onus back on medical providers, both to know what they're doing and to stand behind it. In the conventional medical world, we have the prescription drug monitoring system, which are interstate monitoring systems so that we can have an idea of whether people are purchasing excessively and such like that. In Massachusetts, interestingly enough, we have similar sort of thing for medical cannabis patients. And I find it extremely useful to know what it is that people are purchasing, particularly in the absence of being able to write the prescription that we've been talking about. And this allows me to engage with my patients in useful and constructive discussions about how they're using and what they're using. We have to acknowledge that the recreational system is going to overlap with the medical system in many ways. And so we must be on the guard that if the industry encourages people to take advantage of the recreational system, that they shouldn't be doing so for medical purposes, and they should not be giving medical advice through that system any more than they should be through the medical system. And then, of course, there needs to be a robust research agenda so that we can better answer the many, many questions that still exist around this medication. I've mentioned the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists. You can see our URL down on the left there. Our goals really are to increase the standard of care for patients, to make sure that they're getting the same level of care with regard to cannabinoid medicines that they would be from any other medication. We provide education for doctors and other clinicians that we call referring physicians or clinicians. These are the people, primary care neurologists, those sorts of folks who are not going to be specialists in this area, but need to know enough about it to understand its legitimacy and its use so that they can refer their appropriate patients to the specialists. We provide education for the specialists to make sure that everybody is playing from the same deck and using the best practices and data that we have available. We work with dispensaries and product manufacturers to improve their the quality of their products, as well as the quality of their interaction with our patients. We encourage this research agenda that we've talked about, and we want to work to improve the law and regulation so that patients are getting better care. And this is my last slide. Oh, I really whizzed through that. I guess we'll have lots of time for questions. So if anybody has questions, please put them in the Q&A box. I am available to answer questions if we don't get to your questions this evening. So you can find me at inhalemd.com. I have there about 200 articles written for lay people that you may find interesting on various subjects related to medical cannabis. And of course, you can always email me directly at doc@inhalemd.com. So thank you very much for your attention this evening, and I look forward to your questions. I'm going to put the slides away now.
Thank you so much. We have a lot of questions. I'm going to start off with one. Why is cannabis on the Schedule I? And what is the history? Why does it have such a reputation?
Yes, very interesting question. Let me start by saying that cannabis was never outlawed in this country based on science or medical opinion. When it was outlawed nationally in 1937 with the Marijuana Tax Act, it was basically being outlawed as an agricultural commodity because there were large corporations that were that owned large forests that they were harvesting for paper and other sorts of pulp from trees, and it had become technologically feasible for small farmers on lousy pieces of land, typically in the southern states, people of color, to farm hemp and to provide the same kind of pulp at a much lower price. And we can see that corporations are not going to like that. And that was really the basis of the Marijuana Tax Act. That went into effect, as I mentioned, in 1937. The American Medical Association at that time objected vociferously to this prohibition because cannabis was, in fact, on the pharmacopoeia at that time and was in use by physicians, but they were not listened to. And so this was the law of the land from 37 to December of 1969, when Timothy Leary won the Supreme Court case, which overturned that particular law. By January of 1970, the Nixon administration had invented the Controlled Substances Act and put cannabis as well as LSD into Schedule I against all of the medical and scientific advice that they were given. And there have been challenges to its Schedule I status pretty much every 2 to 3 years from 1972 to present day. There are a number of quotations that you can find using our dear friend Google that will demonstrate that Nixon was using the Controlled Substances Act Schedule I as a political tool to go after people of color and hippies. That's how we got here.
Thank you. Okay, we have a lot of questions. Okay, marijuana adversely affects one's ability to drive a vehicle. The presence of marijuana in the blood, unlike alcohol and other drugs, does not reflect the effect the drug has on driving ability. How would law enforcement be able to enforce drug driving laws concerning marijuana?
Well, the short answer to that is they can't at the moment. Because you are correct that there is no verifiable, measurable limit in the blood that correlates with level of impairment. So there have been many attempts using per se laws or various kinds of roadside testing kits to come up with a way, and they're never viable and they're never stand up in court. There have then been, as you're all aware, these field sobriety tests that have been validated for alcohol, and there has been an attempt to apply those to cannabis as an issue. And as you're probably aware, there are training centers across the country that make these drug recognition experts from law enforcement agents. And quite frankly, their accuracy is very poor, and in large part because the field sobriety tests were designed for alcohol and not for cannabis. So going forward, we're going to have to come up with something else, but it's not clear to me at this point what that is.
Thank you. Do you see cannabinoids being transferred to one of the scheduled classifications and handled in a pharmacy by pharmacists?
I hope so. I think that in the end, meaning 5, 10, 15 years from now, when we've sorted through some of this regulatory conundrum or quagmire, we're going to find that the pharmaceutical industry is very interested in developing products that are either based on cannabinoids or based on novel chemicals that mimic cannabinoids. So I do think that ultimately we will have to reframe the legal structure here. There's been discussion about moving cannabis, say, off Schedule I to Schedule 2 through 5. Frankly, based on the data that we have, it probably shouldn't be on any of the Controlled Substances Act schedules. It should be regulated by the FDA under the FD&C law. There's this interesting thing right now where we sort of have 3 lanes. We've got the recreational lane, then we've got this medical lane, which is sort of in between in terms of the regulation term between the recreational and then the pharmaceutical. I think it's also important to remind everybody that cannabinoids, particularly THC, have been around as a prescribable pharmaceutical since 1990. So that's 30 some odd years, right? Dronabinol, which is brand named Marinol, has been available for nausea for cancer-induced chemotherapy for decades. The reality here is that almost nobody uses it because it doesn't work very well. And the reason, as we understand it today, is that that's pure THC. And that in fact, while I said that THC is the main medicine, that's not the end of the story. And that there are other chemicals that come along with the THC when we use cannabis. And those things work together to create the effect that we expect. So we've had, and then more recently, CBD is a pharmaceutical from Jazz Pharmaceuticals that is available to treat children with these rare genetic seizure disorders called Dravet syndrome and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, where they have upwards of 100 seizures a day. And it turns out that in that context, CBD can be a very, very helpful anti-epileptic. So I do think that we're going to see more and more understanding of these cannabinoids and more development of pharmaceuticals. The issue in my mind is that we need to not throw out or undermine this middle lane, the medical lane, while we're trying to achieve that level of understanding and research around the pharmaceutical lane, right? We don't want to take patients who are now getting, perhaps we could call it the more crude preparations that are derived from cannabis, but they're getting real benefit and quality of life from it. We don't want to throw them out in the cold because we regulate everything into a pharmaceutical sort of, from day one. So I think that we need, I don't know that we need a recreational policy, but I think we're going to get one. But I think we need a national medical lane policy, which may be something that is sort of a grandfather phase out kind of thing over 10 or 15 years, anticipating moving into the more rigorous pharmaceutical direction.
Yeah. Okay, when you talk about drug interactions with CBD, does this also apply to topical applications of CBD?
No, this is a good news, bad news situation. So cannabinoids, not CBD specifically, but all of them, so THC, CBD, and the whole panoply, they won't go through your skin. That is to say, there are ways using pharmaceutical techniques that we could make them go through your skin, but if you're talking about sort of a routine jar of cannabis salve or something like that that you got at a dispensary, that's basically coconut oil with some weed in it, and that will simply not go through your skin. So the good news is you don't have to worry about the drug interactions. The bad news is it's not really getting into your body, and so it's probably not really doing you a lot of good, but it's making your wallet lighter.
Okay. So marijuana does not cause people to drive drunk like alcohol does, and there's no proof that it impairs one's ability to drive. If it did, people would read about it and see it on the news, but we don't because it doesn't. Do you have a comment about that?
Yeah, I think that the whole impaired driving thing is an interesting and complicated situation. The statement in that was that it does not cause impairment, and we know that that's not true. There are a whole bunch of road studies as well as simulated driving studies that show impairment. But if you look at the highway safety data, which I think is the most interesting and sort of alluded to in that question, what we find is that there is an increase in fatal vehicular outcomes associated with cannabis use. However, the vast majority of that increase is in polysubstance, meaning alcohol plus cannabis. And so if you factor out the alcohol plus cannabis, what you see is only about a 2% increase in fatal outcomes. I don't think that we can downplay the importance of people being properly warned and educated not to do these things. But at the same time, I don't think we want to make a societal decision to either ban cannabis because of this or to incarcerate more people because of this. So I think that we need to put that risk in its place, which is fairly low, and really spend some money and some time on educational programs so that people are aware that they are putting themselves and the public at danger if they do these sorts of things.
I think we all remember those drunk driver ads when they came on television at one point. Whole education. Okay, secondhand smoke can be hazardous. Have there been any studies done for secondhand marijuana smoke? And can an innocent bystander or child be adversely impacted?
Yes, there have been some studies. And the short answer is we don't think that in a reasonably ventilated space that there's much, if any, risk from secondhand smoke related to cannabis. There was one study where they put a bystander in essentially a 6-foot box with no ventilation, and in those circumstances they were able to measure cannabinoids in the bystander's blood system. But any sort of a normal ventilated room, the answer is we've not been able to see that, and we have not seen ill effects on children.
This is sort of a part B to a question that was asked earlier. What about transdermal creams? They enter the bloodstream. Will they have an interaction?
So if the cannabinoids get into your bloodstream, then yes, they could have an interaction. On the other hand, there are many products out there that are claiming to be able to go through the skin, and I have yet to see any that accomplish these claims. It's not difficult to do. You just have to know the chemistry, but it doesn't seem to be common knowledge in the cannabis industry at the moment.
Is this the first time in history that medicine is being used widely for recreation by people who do not need it medically?
Well, I think that we have seen other substances that are purely medical being misused for recreational purposes. And I think that, we can look at the opioids as a good example of that. But it is true that this is a unique situation that complicates our thinking and our regulation, because it is, to my knowledge, the first substance that is reasonably safe enough that the recreational use can be considered legitimate, and additionally its use for medical purposes is also legitimate. And so regulating the same substance in sort of two different paradigms, I think is creating real problems for regulators and certainly for we physicians.
Okay, my dispensary doesn't push anything on me, and I like getting discounts and other deals on my medication, especially when it saves me money. What I would really like is for Medicare to pay for it. When will marijuana be covered in my Part D?
Let me say this. I think that the degree to which patients sort of dally around with their cannabis is concerning to me, and I've seen it lead to many bad outcomes. So I don't personally think that it is a good idea for dispensaries to be allowed to have, specials and deals like that. I would rather see them simply reduce their prices across the board. On the recreational side, if they want to have prize wheels and Vanna White and whatever, that's fine. But fundamentally, it is a basic understanding in the law and culture of our country that patients are a unique and protected class of people who are, by the nature of their illness, less capable of upholding caveat emptor. And so we take great strides to make sure that people get what they need and are not getting bamboozled. That does not mean that you can't enjoy your deals, but I don't think that that's the basis by which we should set up a regulated system. To your question about insurance coverage, it's complicated. Right now, while it's federally illegal, no insurance company is going to touch it. There are insurance companies that pay for medical cannabis in other countries like Canada. Clearly, the Medicare, which is a federal institution, is not going to do this while it is illegal. So clearly, we need to change that aspect of it. On the other hand, if we legalize it purely for recreational purposes, then they won't cover it either, because then it's not medical, right? So we have to be a little bit careful about how we frame this. And we also know that there's at least some discussion in the pharmaceutical industry about not wanting insurance coverage for cannabis rather than for pharmaceutical versions. But my experience, at least to date, has been that the pharmaceutical companies are eager to get into this business and will take the reimbursement however it comes.
Okay. How do you explain the fact that some people don't get high or intoxicated from marijuana use?
I think they're like Mr. Clinton, they didn't inhale. But less tongue-in-cheek. There is a very beginning of an understanding of the difference that genetics play in the metabolism of various cannabinoids. And so there are people who have genes for what is called fast metabolizer, and it may be that has an impact upon whether they feel this the intoxication or not. So it's probably some combination of different metabolism and also different dosing.
Okay, let's see. All right, this is a little bit out of your wheelhouse perhaps, but maybe not. So starting in 2023, Oregon will be the first state with widely legalized psychedelics. Technically, the state didn't approve psychedelic therapy, though the program is often interpreted as such. Ballot Measure 109, which passed in November 2020, gave the Oregon Health Authority the job of overseeing magic mushroom consumption at service centers in the presence of licensed facilitators. Thoughts?
You know, one of the reasons why Nixon was so unhappy with the hippies was because many of these things that we think of now as drugs started out as therapeutic agents, and that include LSD and psilocybin. There's research from the 40s and 50s that was really quite compelling for the time on the use of LSD for anxiety and depression and for alcoholism, etc. And it was through the 60s and sort of the events of the counterculture that led to sort of a backlash. And I'm concerned that we may be seeing that sort of thing happen again. That is to say, I don't know that I think that the ways in which psilocybin and LSD are being regulated on the western side of our country are really going to be sufficiently medically oriented to achieve the best benefit and to prevent the risks associated. I think that, you know, many of these medications are extraordinarily powerful and useful, but really should be used in the context of medical care and psychiatric care. And I'm just not sure that this glee that we're seeing at the moment about legalization of various substances is going to translate into things being done well. I think they're going to be done in a profitable fashion, and that concerns me.
Okay. Is there any help for dementia patients?
That's a great question, one that I struggle with a lot. So there are kind of two answers there. There's symptoms and disease. When it comes to issues around anxiety and agitation, cannabis can be very helpful for patients with dementia, whether we're talking about early stages or the later stages where things may be less in control. So in those circumstances, I think it's very reasonable to use cannabis or cannabinoids. The administration, that's another discussion and can be challenging, particularly in people whose dementia is more advanced. There's also this idea that cannabis or cannabinoids might be what's called neuroprotective. And the idea is that by taking these cannabinoids, you can either prevent or slow the progression of these neurodegenerative diseases. And this idea is not related necessarily specifically to dementia. It's also been proposed in neuromuscular diseases like ALS and MS. There's a lot of really good data to support this at the level of the test tube. The problem is none of us are test tubes. In fact, none of us are mice. I was prompted some years ago to look up what percentage of medications that work for mice do not work for human beings. And it turns out to be a whopping 92%. 92% of the medicines that look good in mice fail in human beings, leaving open the question of why we use mice at all. Mice are a great example of being the most mouse-like mice there are, but it doesn't really reflect humans very well. And this is why a lot of research has moved back in the direction of cell culture, which are in fact human cells, but then again, it's not an intact organism. So there's just trade-offs there. So I think that the lay press, which likes to talk about this neuroprotection, is kind of ahead of itself a little bit. I tend to think about these things for human patients in terms of that anxiety and behavioral control, and not so much in the neuroprotective arena just yet. More data, more story to come.
Okay. I have a question. It's a long question, but the very end of it says they'd like to see the drug interaction chart again. Are you okay if we send that to people afterwards?
Sure.
Okay, so we'll send it in the follow-up email, whoever anonymous attendee is that wanted to see that.
I just want to add one comment, which is to say that though there are many things on that list, it is certainly not intended to be an exhaustive list. And so if there's something on there, that's great. But the fact that something's not on there does not mean that it is without potential problems.
Okay, so I see we're running late, so I'm going to take one more question and then we'll close. Several states require pharmacists to be involved in medical marijuana dispensing. Do you think medical dispensaries should be required to be staffed by pharmacists?
I do think that there needs to be a pharmacist involved. I don't know that I think that they need to be involved in every transaction. I think they can be more of an advisory or supervisory role. But I also think that that just like in a CVS or any other conventional dispensing setup, the role of the pharmacist can be compromised, right? That is to say, in a system where there is a profit motive and they are an employee of that company, if the regulatory systems are not in place to keep that conflict in check, then they too become subject to that conflict of interest, albeit with much more education, but at the end of the day, their job is on the line, and that's a problem.
And there's one comment I'm going to read because it reminds me of things I should have said at the beginning of the presentation. A physician, Stacy Keene, who is a co-chair of the Physicians Council, she wrote, "There's great ongoing research, phase 3 clinical trials on MDMA and psilocybin, I can't even pronounce it. Yes, for depression and PTSD. Yeah. So that is a great way for me to say that Dr. Tishler is a member of our Physicians Council Steering Committee. And if you are a physician, we would love to have you. If you are an educator, we are starting an educators council. If you are a nurse or an allied health professional, we have a council for you. And obviously the attorneys and judges. So thank you so much, Dr. Tishler. I know people just from the comments loved hearing you. Thank you for coming back. And I'm just going to close the program.
Carol, before you
Yes.
close the program, let me just say that if there are people out there who have questions that remain, or we didn't get to your questions, do please email me. I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Okay, so we could put your email in the chat again, if you remind us what it is.
Doc, D-O-C, at inhalemd.com.
Thank you.
Perfect. Yep. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Tishler. Thank you all, our attendees, for coming and for asking such wonderful questions. If you're interested in joining the Attorneys and Judges Council, which sponsored this talk, please send a note to the Attorneys and Judges Council email address in the chat. One of the programs coming up is very exciting from the Attorneys and Judges, is a special trip to Israel in July of 2023. This is a tour of Israel through a legal lens. So you will get an experience that you won't get anywhere else. You will get to learn about the differences between the US and Israeli law system. You will learn about what legal means you can use to fight terrorism. Very important, you'll learn the kashrut laws about wine as you visit and taste wine at a local winery. And you will do lots of other normal touring things, but this will be a very special trip, including a visit to the Supreme Court and talking to a justice there, learning about Israel and they don't have a constitution. So how does their country work? So it will be a fabulous trip. So stay tuned for more information on that. We hope to see you in November at our 100th convention in Jerusalem. On a sad note, we will not be going to the Supreme Court and bringing attorneys there to get sworn in this year because of COVID protocols. The restrictions are so tight that it wouldn't be the experience that you expect from us. So please look forward to that in 2024. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the fundraising project that the attorneys and judges have chosen. Nearly a third of the children in Israel live in poverty, and almost 500,000 suffer from high-risk situations such as abuse, learning disabilities, or lack of basic needs. Still, others come to us from places around the world where it is no longer safe to be a Jew. Our youth Aliyah villages provide a safe haven for them. It gives them counseling, it gives them confidence, it gives them education. And we have had over 300,000 students from 80 lands who graduated from our youth villages. So they get a full spectrum of help. And especially for our 11th and 12th graders, we provide a trip to Poland for them to learn about pre-war Jewry and the Holocaust. And during this extraordinary 8-day experience, our students tour concentration camps and Jewish sites, learning about their cultural, historical, and religious significance. This trip is a profound and memorable experience for these students and helps them develop a sense of pride and commitment to Israel and the Jewish people. So if you are interested in supporting those trips to Poland for those children, please click on the link in the chat. So I want to thank you once again. May you all be written in the book of health and happiness and success and fulfillment this year. Happy New Year, and thank you for joining us.